Okay, I'm so excited to be here to talk with you all about founder-led selling, largely because I'm a huge fan of both David and Stephanie. I've been reading David's stuff forever, and it's really helped me in my journey as an entrepreneur. And then I actually already knew Stephanie by virtue of executing some of the stuff that I talk about for my current company, Atrium, where we did a customer development interview with Stephanie probably about 18 months or 24 months ago. It's in Salesforce, I could go look it up. So we're gonna talk a little bit about founder-led selling and how at the beginning of that process that David talked about, that you as the founder are really irreplaceable as that initial person who can prove the initial proof of value exchange that we'll talk about a little bit here. I'll kind of tell you why I might be qualified to present on this. My background is not as a salesperson or a sales leader, even though that's now what I play on TV. My background is as a product marketer and a product manager that started a software company called TalentBin. I was a business generalist founder that then became the first rep, first sales manager, eventually our VP, quote unquote VP of sales. When we were eventually acquired by Monster Worldwide, we had about 20 sales, combination of SDRs and AEs when we were acquired by Monster. So this is kind of the process that I went through as a founder. Cool. We skipped that. Or actually, and then after leading new product sales at Monster, which was a little bit of a change because it went from running a really process excellent, small, tight A-team of salespeople at TalentBin, I instead was responsible for new product sales for 600 old school sales reps at Monster, which was a little bit of a different experience. I wrote a book on sales for founders. It's called Founding Sales. It hasn't been published yet, but there's a Google Doc floating around of all the content that people just kind of seem to pass around to each other. And I'm also the founder of a sales performance analytics company called Atrium, and I run the canonical sales operations enablement and leadership community called Modern Sales. So that's me. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about first is why founders maybe have a little bit of an antipathy for sales and like why you have to get over that. I had the same issue. And so I kind of did some introspection around why that might be the case and why it might block people from kind of deciding that they want to embrace revenue acquisition. And I think these are some of the issues that drive to that. So like, first of all, a lot of founders, I know that probably about 70% of the people in this room are founders without a sales background. So as a result, you have this comprehension of like your own experience with sales is things that you've seen on TV. A lot of the times you see founders come from a product or an engineering background, so you're not necessarily somebody who has spent a lot of their time interfacing with lots and lots and lots of humans on an ongoing basis, which is essentially what salespeople do. No, I mean, it's kind of a mind-blowing experience when you have your first day of having 5 of the same conversation, in a row for an entire day, and then you have to do it again the next day, and you have to do it again the next day. So those are some of the reasons why I think that you see this. And so what you end up with is like people like to tell themselves these stories that there are these anti-patterns that you can potentially engage in because it makes you feel good about the fact that you don't want to sell. And so if you look, so these are some of the kind of canonical examples there. But then when you really dig into it and look at what these organizations' employee bases look like, they're full of salespeople, right? Twilio, Stripe, Square, Slack, Dropbox, Palantir, Atlassian, they're filthy with salespeople. And so thinking that this is, like, if you think that if this is the case of how they're getting to scale, you're wrong. So just recognize that. Some of the other kind of seductive, crappy anti-patterns that you see as a result of founders resisting from really getting their hands dirty is, one is, I call it, let's sprinkle some sales on it. Let's just go and we'll get a sales bro or broette, and we'll just sprinkle some sales on it, and it'll be fine. And this kind of goes to David's point earlier about if you jump ahead a stage or multiple stages before you've hit the exit criteria for a precursor stage, you can have disastrous consequences. I think Steve Blank talks about this. It's like, you can't get to scale until you've killed the first couple VPs of sales. That's actually not all that great. And another example of an anti-pattern here is like not actually selling to real customers, but instead just doing lots of revenue swaps with other people in your accelerator. So where does the disconnect come from here? We talked about this. Founders frequently come from an engineering or product background. As a result, they don't necessarily have the muscles for engaging non-friendly parties, scalably engaging with prospects, et cetera. Similarly, an important thing to realize as to why traditional sellers are not the right person to figure this thing out initially is because they don't have the skills necessarily. Not 100%, because Stephanie's going to talk about like a special breed of seller, but they don't necessarily have the skills to debug and bake the sales process that they will then execute themselves. They're more people who execute an existing sales process. So what are the downsides associated with this? These are just some examples of kind of the implications of these anti-patterns. This is a delightful Twitter conversation I had with some founder who was saying something along the lines of like, oh my gosh, if you cold email people in order to do prospecting, kill yourself. And I was like, okay, that seems like not a good idea given the fact that like Yelp and OpenTable and Grubhub do exactly that for their go-to-market. And he was like, okay, well, you don't know what you're talking about. 18 months later, I set a reminder on my calendar. His company was dead. And so you can see the people who actually were happy to embrace muscular go-to-market are not dead. In fact, they're thriving. Flip side, example here of kind of not having intentional, scalable go-to-market, but instead kind of going all in would be Zenefits. It's a different anti-pattern, but it kind of comes from the same root cause. And so that's obviously a different problem. And so I think the important thing for folks to realize is that, yes, sales used to be a certain way that maybe was meriting of your skepticism. And David talks about this. He'll talk about this later with respect to outside sales go-to-markets and versus inside sales go-to-markets. But actually, sales is becoming, or it is now scientific by virtue of a lot of things that have happened. Better data access, better ability to target people proactively that have your problems that you're trying to solve. And so, as a result, this is something that not only can you embrace, but you ought to embrace. Because again, the downsides of not are really problematic. So that's my sermon on why you ought to care about this. So then David kind of spoke about this, so I'm not going to rehash this, but again, these are the various steps that you want to go through. And notice that after you exit one step, does it actually work? Yes, it does. Or sorry, do we know what problem we're solving? There's a bunch of work there, grinding, grind. Yes, we do know what problem we're solving. Does it actually work? No, the product is crappy. Grind, ship a lot of product. Oh, look, it actually does work and delivers value. Cool, well, people give me money for that value now. Grind. So those are the various stages. I'll talk about some of the earliest ones, and then Stephanie's gonna dig into the later ones. There's a little bit of overlap there. So these are the various stages, and then an important thing about this is they're not the same in terms of how much value they unlock, insofar as the way that SaaS businesses and hardware businesses, B2B businesses typically get to scale is by adding out more quota-bearing sales reps to do more parallelized revenue acquisition. So some of these later stages are the place at which you can really unlock that discontinuous value creation for or enterprise value creation. So for instance, if only the founder can sell that, that's kind of a problem because you only have 40 hours in the week or 60 hours or 80 hours or whatever, depending on how bad you're killing yourself. So as soon as you can abstract yourself, now you can put that sales software that you've created, pull it out of your brain and instantiate it in the brain of other sellers. And then moreover, if you can do that with 5 people, that's all well and good, but then there's other stages of abstraction at which now you can get really, really parallelized and take over the world. So these are the various stages that I'm not going to rehash for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the first couple stages here, and And we're going to talk about entry criteria, exit criteria, and then the things you should be doing during those stages. And to reiterate what David was saying, you don't want to work on the things that are important right now, that are in the critical path right now, that are going to allow you to progress to that next stage where you will then work on the thing that is then in the critical path then. Don't work on the thing later that will be valuable later when you haven't solved the things that are important now. So let's define what those are. Customer development, as David points out, there's been a lot of ink spilled on this. People still don't 100% do a great job at it though. Because when I talk with a lot of founders, like, so cool, how many customer interviews did you do? And they're like, 3. I'm like, that's not that many. For example, at Atrium, we did about, I think it was between 100 and 150 customer interviews during the first half of 2016. Stephanie was one of the ones who participated in there. So in the customer development process, you want to engage with potential customers in order to back-check your hypotheses about whether or not they actually have this problem, and then present to them what you think could be the solution to that. The person who's going to be doing this, ideally, it's both the business and the tech founders together. And then the way that you know that you're ready to start building is that when you've executed a statistically significant number of these interviews, not 3, probably not 150, I think we were going a little crazy, you start seeing patterns pretty quickly, like a dozen, a couple dozen, or what have you. And then you know you're ready to start building. Anti-pattern would be, I'm just going to start building in a cave, and then you're going to take it to market. And if you're lucky, it works, but more likely it's going to bounce off of your prospects, and you're going to quote Paul Graham, you're going to build something that people don't want. Usually the person who does this is the business founder as the lead on this. This is something that Stephanie pointed out. So Stephanie previously was at Xamarin, who essentially had 2 technical founders. I conceive of an ideal founding team as a technical and a business founder together. That's not always 100% the case. There's a lot of the prescriptions here presuppose that that's the architecture. Some resources that you can use for this. David talked about Lean Startup. Steve Blank's Startup Owner's Manual is great. They're both kind of long. If you want to do the MVP Cliffs Notes version of this, there's a great article in First Round Review called Get in the Van by Michael Sippy. It's awesome. I present that, I have everyone read that. Cool, so that's the first stage. Then once you've progressed through that and you know that people actually say, yeah, I do actually have that problem, and that thing you're thinking about building, Pete, I could totally imagine using that. We actually want to prove that the thing that we built does work. And so the idea here is that we want to elicit a dozen or so beta customers who will deploy this in order to, not for the purpose of we're not trying to get scalable revenue at this point in time. We're literally just trying to prove that the magical widget that we created does the thing that we sought out for it to do. It solves the problem that we validated existed and was painful. One of the things that can be really helpful during this period is as you're doing these interview processes, you'll find people who are smart and helpful and are excited about what it is that you're working on, people like Stephanie, and you can put them in your back pocket for later. You can keep track of them in your CRM. You can put them on your customer advisory panel. I have an article in the First Round Review on customer advisory boards. But then when you show up at this stage, after having done all your interviews, and now you have a couple dozen of those folks in your back pocket who you validated are smart and excited about these things, you can go back to them and say, hey, I know that you were excited about this and you said that you had this pain. You also said that you would pay this amount for it in our interview when you didn't think I was going to come back and hold you to it, but I took notes on it. You can go to those folks, deploy your solution, and then literally all we're trying to do here is demonstrate that our product solves the problem that we set out to solve as delineated by these KPIs that we're looking to hit. So in the case of Xamarin, if you use Xamarin, it reduces your cross-platform development time of mobile apps by 30%, which is this amount of engineering hours. 45. Sorry. Whatever the KPI was, or set of KPIs are, we're now proving that it's solved. Again, it's you as the person doing this. These are other resources that you could potentially dig into. I tweeted the slides for these earlier. These are just hyperlinks that point off to other materials, whether it's founding sales or other publications from various folks. But these are the tools that you would use for that. Cool. Will someone pay? So conveniently, we have now proven that the thing we built solves the problem demonstrably that we set out to solve. It creates business value, 45% reduction in development time for MOBA developers, or fill in the blank. And so now what we want to do is get people to pay for that, to give us money in exchange for that. The tools that would be useful for that, pricing, based on that ROI rationale. I think David was talking about like pricing optimization or what have you as being like a later stage thing. It's totally right. Like literally all we're trying to do is prove that someone will non-zero give us money in exchange for this product. And so the way that you know that you're ready to progress past this is that you have, again, a set of customers that is giving you money for that. And importantly, getting the value out of the solution that was promised. We had this problem a little bit at Talent Bin where we got a little whole hog on selling and didn't focus as much on customer success as we should have. And so we got really good at selling via demo, but didn't necessarily instrument the value capture. And so that's an important thing to make sure that everything is tight, is making sure that they're giving you money in exchange for the solution, but then they're getting the value back for the money that they gave you. Primary anti-pattern for this would be not doing it, being afraid to ask for money. And this might, oftentimes this comes from people who are not comfortable with this, and the response to that is that you have to get over it. It's just something that comes with practice in the mirror, practice with your friends, what have you. The other thing that really helps with this is that if you do have really muscular ROI metrics from your beta customers, it's kind of one of those things where like, why would you not give me? So in the case of, let's use Xamarin as an example, mobile software engineer costs $150,000 a year, and if I can save you 45% of time on cross-platform development, well, that's a lot of money of salary expense, so you maybe should give me a couple $1,000s a year for a software license for Xamarin. Like you'd be a moron not to. Don't you agree? Yes, I do. Take my money. So again, this is largely still being done by the individual because what you're doing at this point is you're baking the initial, what's referred to as the sales motion. You're baking that software through trial and error on your local, if you will. So the next step is, will many people pay for this? And this was the joke I was saying before about the pleasantness associated with having the same conversation with the same profile of prospect, 3 to 5 times a day, day in, day out. But what you're doing when you're doing that is you're finding all the corner cases, you're finding all the objections. You as the subject matter expert will have responses to that, or if you don't have a response to that and the product doesn't have it, that's actually a product requirement that goes back to product management. Or if you do have an answer to it, it's the handle for an objection, and of course you're now documenting that such that we can give it to somebody else when they come on board. The one thing where you can kind of abstract here, and again on the bottom of this diagram right here, I have this notion of lead gen versus selling versus customer success. And in previous stages, the founder was doing, was doing that himself or herself. So one of the things you can potentially do here is get leverage through abstraction. One way you can do that is by hiring a sales development rep at this point in time, at this stage. There's also kind of like robot sales development reps at this point. Companies like Grow Labs or Outbound Work or Apollo or what have you that can be helpful in scalably prospecting and putting things on your calendar. So that way you can spend more of your time doing selling and success. The other pattern you can do here, this is the pattern that we used this time around for Atrium, was by virtue of the fact that I run the nation's largest sales operations and leadership community. I know a lot of sales operations and sales enablement leaders, and so it's very easy for me to get meetings for sales purposes. So it's less important for me to have an SDR, but it's more important for me to have CS help such that when I close customers, I can toss them over to CS and they can take them and be on their merry way. So those are kind of two ways that you can do that abstraction at this stage, because the whole idea here is we're trying to get small scale repeatable here. You can also just do it yourself, but those are ways of getting leverage. Next. So the idea here, of course, is that we're engaging in a pretty hefty number of customer-facing engagements, arm's length. Like, we're not selling to the uncle, we're not selling to our batchmates, unless, of course, they are ideal customer profile. But the idea here is that we're engaging, we're testing that in interactions with the market with somebody who doesn't owe us anything, that they will comprehend the value that we're bringing to them, the value proposition that we're bringing to them, and they'll transact with us. Exit criteria, 1 or 2 dozen customers, and the idea here is that you have the beginnings of a documented sales motion. That doesn't mean that it's a nested bullets of specific stepwise process. Could be that, but the idea here is that you've gotten to the point where you've baked this software that you can just run yourself, almost kind of as a second thought. The anti-pattern here would be jumping ahead and having kind of the sprinkling some sales on it and having somebody else try to do this themselves. Unless potentially you have that magical unicorn of a early stage evangelical sales leader who's really more of a weaponized product manager, product marketer anyway. But again, that's really difficult to find, and usually that's more of a business co-founder anyway. Cool. So then, can non-founders sell this? This is a point where there's like a little bit of a fork in the decision tree. I think Stephanie's going to talk about this a little bit later. But now what we're trying to do is prove that someone who's not you, who doesn't have all of that year, 24 months of subject matter expertise from all of the customer interviews and all of the early terrible demos you did and having been punched in the face by so many different prospects, someone who doesn't have that all in here can do this. And so that's kind of what our goal is right here. And so oftentimes what that looks, this is kind of the organizational architecture for that. The way that I approach this, insofar as I've now done this myself and I have the acumen to do this, and I have technical co-founders who can mind the store while I'm doing this. This is actually the stage that my current company's in right now. So I'm doing this process, and the business founder can do this. The other example, so like use Xamarin as an example, where you have 2 technical co-founders, or if you're a solo founder or what have you, this might be the point at which the opportunity cost of doing this yourself, having already done this, is too great, and as a result, you then abstract management earlier than you would have otherwise if you could do this yourself. So that's why that's right there. The way that I mean, generally, I think if you have a business founder, hiring account executives and pouring your brain into theirs and then focusing on getting them to success is the superior way of going about this. But it's not 100% the pound the table prescription. So the biggest delta here is that whereas previously you were focused on selling and interacting with customers consistently, you're now actually focusing on enabling other people to do that. So you're hiring and you're training and you're doing documentation and you're putting people through their paces and you're doing mock demos and you're listening to their calls and then you're coaching them up. And this is actually a new set of muscles for a lot of people who haven't necessarily managed somebody before, but they're important. So the exit criteria here is when you get these folks, the account executives, the other sellers, selling at least as well as you were. And this is why earlier when you were proving this statistical significance of your own selling motion, that was important because now not only did you bake the sales software, but now you know what good looks like. So if we can get these other account executives on and get them to good as well, we know that we're ready to scale to the next step there. The anti-pattern here is it's a little tough, kind of squishy, but you don't want to hire too many folks, but also you don't want to hire too few. I don't have a great answer there, but you know when you see it. So this is the point at which, this is like just a more evolved version of the previous one. And again, this is the business founder, evangelical sales manager like Stephanie's going to talk about, where literally you're out of the business of selling because you've gotten to the point where you've gotten to the point where you know that you can get other people to sell themselves. And now instead what you're focused on, I call this a revenue mitochondria. I don't know why I don't have a better example or a better term for that. But you're now focused on the cohesion of this unit of revenue production, sales development rep to account executives to a customer success manager, and making sure that that whole thing is tight. Because what we're doing is once we can get that tight, what we want to be able to do is just clone that out as many times as possible. So the behaviors here are not dissimilar from the ones in the previous stage, but the individual is the business founder is fully out of the day-to-day selling, with the exception of, oh, I need to bring in my boss, to help close this deal or what have you, but literally not focused on selling, not focused on actually chopping the wood or carrying the water, but instead enabling the system for other people to chop wood and carry water. So those are the stages during founder-led selling. If you do those successfully, you will then be set up to scale that up further. But if you try to skip past those and instead jump ahead without having proven that that your product solves the problem that it sets out to solve, that people will give you money in exchange for it, and that people other than the founders can sell it, you're going to be setting yourself up for problems of the sort that you saw in the earlier slides. So don't do that. So you can find me online. I'm at Kazanjy on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Pete Kazanjy in the United States. Again, I run a software company called Atrium, Killer Performance Analytics for Sales Reps. Founding Sales, the book on sales for founders. It's a lot of where this content came from. And I run a community for sales leadership, sales operations, and sales enablement folks, and founders who are focused on that, who are going through this journey themselves. So you can find me in all those various places. Thanks.